Anthony Albanese's whole sort of political understanding was forged by the fact that Labor squandered that opportunity with the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments.
Trump, if he was running an election here, he's not popular with Australian voters. His kind of brand of MAGA republicanism has never really had an audience here.
There is a bit of a loss of journalists trusting their instincts about when a party is failing, because journalists really failed to predict the Trump win in 2016, the Morrison win in 2019, Brexit.
Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Bridie.
Good morning, Patrick.
Morning, Bridie.
And good morning, Joe.
Hi, Bridie.
Well, everyone, and I mean everyone, has had their take on the election this week, why we got the result we did, what went wrong, what went right. But what are the real lessons that should be taken from Saturday's election?
I think that's a really interesting question because once you get past the obvious, like Labor triumph, total unmitigated disaster for the coalition, I think there is a tendency for people to read into a result what they want to see, what they want the reason to be. I mean, Labor obviously ran a very tight campaign centred on cost of living, and that succeeded, across the board. And if you look at their 2PP vote, it was like something like 55 to 45, like unbelievable. Their primary vote was still 35%, which historically is quite low. So it would be easy for them to conclude this is an entire endorsement by the progressive people of Australia of our full agenda. But I do think it's more complicated than that, not taking anything away from their victory. Then there's the Trump effect. Yep, there were progressive victories in Canada and Australia. But again, I think it's kind of more complicated. It was definitely an effect, but, there's dispute over exactly how that played. And, the Liberals, they're tearing themselves apart about what lesson to draw from this. So I think it's worth stepping through what happened and the various reasons and taking into account the fact that people want to spin it to mean what they want it to mean.
Yeah, so let's step through that. I think that you have touched on a few things there that we need to dig into. First of all, Trump, something that has played out in local media, but also the international media, is a reading of this election as a rejection of Trump-style culture wars. But is it really that simple?
I think the Trump effect was most definitely there. You can see Labor's polling rise and Dutton's polling fall right from the point of Liberation Day, even almost from the point of inauguration. And you can see in the polls that ask people what they thought about Trump or how they thought about Trump's influence on Australia, it really shifted when the reality of that administration became clear. So that is undoubtedly the case. I think, though, the Trump effect forced Dutton to shift gear in his campaign, and that was part of the reason why his campaign looked so sort of lost and not sure where it was going. And that looking lost and not sure where you're going is a huge voter turnoff in and of itself. So Trump was certainly part of this result. But again, if the Labor Party or progressive politics was to conclude that therefore no MAGA message will ever resonate in Australia, that would, in my view, be taking it too far.
I think there's a danger in interpreting the results and drawing parallels between us and Canada. Canada is much more trade exposed to the US economy than we are. Our exports to the US make up about 5 to 8% of our overall exports. So it's not the 10% tariff that Trump is bringing in is not a big deal economically for us. It is for certain sectors like beef, for example. But overall, it doesn't have the same impact as it does in Canada. And certainly things like Trump saying he wanted to make Canada the 51st state was absolute, just kryptonite.
Well, that
for
would
voters
kind of
in
focus your
Canada.
mind, right?
It would focus your mind, absolutely. But it didn't have the same resonance here. But at the same time, I've said, on this show before that Trump, if he was running an election here, he's not popular with Australian voters. His kind of brand of MAGA republicanism has never really had an audience here apart from, One Nation voters and people on the far right. So it's never had the same kind of purchase here as in the US. And I just don't think that the policies like those, the Department of Government Efficiency and public service cuts really had the same kind of audience of devotees here.
Yeah, on the issue of culture wars, what I thought was sort of interesting about this election is you saw the coalition didn't go kind of full culture war, I think, but they did try to use a couple of very Australian culture wars. And the biggest Australian culture war is energy policy, right? Like that is the thing that Australia's been tearing itself apart over. And I think maybe they thought with nuclear that this would sort of tap into a kind of a backlash that, you know, you certainly see in parts of the Murdoch press that animates a very certain part of the coalition. It really fell very flat. And I don't think this election was fought on nuclear, but it didn't do them any favours in this campaign. I think the work from home policy was another attempt at a kind of a culture war issue. They thought that kind of played well, you know, pitting the kind of the true blue Aussies of the outer suburbs who, you know, have to work with their hands, or nurses or whoever, against the kind of the city elites. And it really fell flat. I don't think that divide really works in Australia. That is sort of a cliche that has been imported from America about how you can divide up the electorate, but it just didn't work here. People were kind of repulsed by it, and we saw the incredibly dramatic backflip early in the campaign. So there were some really ham-fisted attempts at culture wars in this campaign, but it didn't go the way they wanted to. That being said, I think the narrative that's developing about how Australians rejected divisiveness is an interesting one, and one that I think it's hard to make that argument. This was an election, you know, that came only 2 years after The Voice, which went one way. People are now saying, oh, well, it's a completely different Australia. I just don't think you can square those two things. I think Labor made itself a very small target on kind of issues around race. They didn't campaign on any big Indigenous policies. They didn't campaign on Israel, Gaza, or anything else that sort of might have animated a culture war, and fought it on, you know, more material, everyday concerns. So I don't think we really had a culture war at election, and as far as we did, it was very strange Australian culture wars, not Trump
Although
culture
there
wars.
were a few last minute kind of culture war issues, like the you know, the flag, Dutton saying he wouldn't stand for it, and welcome to country, obviously, which was the big one.
And that was interesting because when the coalition tried to inject it into the campaign in the sort of dying weeks of the campaign, Labor didn't really bite on it in that context. They sort of tried to dead bat it. They didn't agree with him that, you know, there are too many welcomes to country. But in that debate, in that last debate when it came up, Albanese sort of danced around it. Then in his victory speech, he came right back and said, we'll have acknowledgements of country. That was sort of conflated with welcomes to country. Anyway, that's another point. The Liberals made a sort of half-hearted attempt to inject that into the debate and remind people of the Voice campaign late. And Labor didn't really fight it, but then kind of claimed it after the event.
And much has been made about the future of the Liberal Party, obviously, in the past few days. And you can see some internal politicking going on. Some people arguing they need to go more right-wing. Some people arguing they need to get back to the centre if they're going to win over mainstream Australia. How does that party go about rebuilding from now?
God knows. I mean, it's pretty obvious. The numbers on the page tell you what they need to do. They need to appeal more to city voters, both inner city and outer urban voters. They need to appeal to women. They need to appeal to younger people. The makeup of their party is almost guaranteed to think differently to that because it's very conservative and almost entirely rural. The Nationals are proportionally larger in the joint party room. The makeup of their party membership is almost guaranteed to pull them in a different direction because it's, you know, predominantly older white blokes. The donors like Gina Rinehart and several other of their most generous donors are saying you need to go more MAGA, you need to go more hardline right wing, or else we're not going to give you any more money. So all their structural pressures are pushing them to do the thing which, by the way I'm reading the electoral numbers, will actually mean that things get worse for them, not better.
But I think there's a danger in saying this is an existential crisis for the Liberal Party. Parties have faced these problems before. Like in 2011, I was working for Labor in their disastrous campaign in New South Wales, and there were a lot of think pieces I remember back there in the AFR and the Australian saying, Labor can't come back from this. Their primary vote is declining. The systems like having unions and branches voting for candidates isn't working anymore because of the decline in participation. We're going to end up with poor quality candidates, and they're not going to be able to win elections. But parties change, they evolve, and they need to because they realise that if they keep on losing, they've got to try something different. The Liberal Party, may have some difficult elections coming up, but they will change and they'll have to change. It's a party that's been around, for a very long time in Australian politics. It's been very successful in Australian politics. It's held government more than any other party. So I think there is a danger in just completely writing them off at this point.
Yeah, I mean, like Lenore said with an election result, I think in this post-mortem, these things tend to act as a bit of a Rorschach test. Like, people are seeing in the Liberals' failure what they want to believe about it. You're seeing people on the moderate saying the issue is we don't have enough women, we need quotas. You're seeing Gina Reinhart release an incredibly entertaining statement sort of saying that they were spooked from going to Trump and through the path of Trump lies the answer. So there's a lot of self-interest here. I think history can be quite instructive for the Liberals, and I think what the Liberals managed to do in New South Wales is actually really interesting. Like, yes, they lost power at the last state election in New South Wales, but you had 12 years of a very stable, popular Liberal government, despite the leadership churn that ICAC caused them. And how did they do it? They had brought together the moderate and the conservative wings of the party. They had a progressive energy policy. They didn't indulge in culture wars. They just embraced renewable energy and pushed on with that, despite even having some quite conservative leaders, like someone like Dominic Perrottet, very conservative, high-profile Catholic. He sort of put his own views aside and didn't prosecute those personal issues. He pushed ahead with kind of service delivery. That's what they were relentlessly focused on. And they embraced leaders like Gladys Berejiklian, a second-generation migrant woman, fairly progressive. And, it really worked for them. And I think rather than sort of tearing their hair out about how can this possibly work? Well, it has worked for the Liberal Party in places.
I absolutely agree with you. My fascination is how they would get from here to there.
Yeah.
And given the structural elements the structural factors that are at play, I find that kind of fascinating.
Well, whenever I'm reading obituaries for a party, I remember covering Queensland politics when Labor was reduced to 6 weeks.
The phone booth.
And how it was going to be impossible for them to come back within 2 terms, maybe even 3, and then covering the election after that and seeing what happened. 3 years can be a long time in politics. So I think that Labor should be keeping the lessons from those Queensland elections a decade ago in mind as well. What should Labor be learning from this election?
I mean, I think Albanese made exactly that point. I think the lessons he is drawing are, to my way of thinking, probably correct politically. Anthony Albanese's whole sort of political understanding was forged by the fact that Labor squandered that opportunity with the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments to really change. They got their chance at power and they didn't change the country like they could have because they were too busy tearing themselves apart. And by the 2019 loss, where they, in his mind, reached too far and didn't win the election that they could have won. And so he has, from the point he came in 2022, said, I'm going to govern from the centre. I'm going to keep those families in mind. I'm not going to surprise anyone. I'm not, people are sick of conflict. I'm not going to give them conflict. And through that term of government, people were disenchanted with him a bit. You're not doing enough. A lot of progressive voters felt like he should have been doing more. And that is an absolutely valid argument, one we might have made in the editorial. But his view is, I've charted my course, and so I think he can feel vindicated in the result that course has resonated with voters. And he couches it in a way of restoring faith in democracy, that it can just deliver for you and it doesn't think about itself and it doesn't, it isn't a self-centered, self-interested, fight pit. It's something that just delivers for people. That's how he sees it. I guess the danger is if it's not delivering enough after another term or another term, how cautious he is, how he uses the mandate he's been given and the political capital he has. But I think it's quite interesting how he can, I think, probably legitimately take assurance from the result that his analysis of what Australians wanted does bear out.
There was plenty of editorialising from almost every newspaper about what a disastrous campaign the Liberals ran after we all knew the result. But there was also quite a few papers that endorsed Dutton for Prime Minister in the days before the election. Does this reveal anything about their influence?
Well, there's sort of 2 different questions there. I mean, if you're you're a conservative-minded paper, you might, inherently think that the conservative policies are better. I don't really see how you could, in faith endorse Peter Dutton as Prime Minister given the campaign that he ran. I think it was so haphazard and so lacking in just coherence that editorialising in favour of him would have been difficult, but several papers did. What amused me was then 2 days later them saying, see, he was obviously never going to get there. That kind of volte-face was pretty amazing. But I think, as I think I said before the election, I don't know that editorials sway very many voters. And certainly, as Meg Simons wrote on The Guardian, the once very powerful influence of News Corp to sway elections was not evident either, because they were very clearly, for the most part, sort of supporting Peter Dutton, and it didn't seem to make much difference.
I think the influence and the clear influence of News Corp, Sky After Dark, 2GB, has been on the Liberal Party and the National Party itself. And that's the problem, and it goes to the structural problem that Lenore was talking about. So many of these policies that were complete duds with the wider electorate, like work from home, were incredibly popular in the Oz, and Sky loved them. But when it came to sell them to the voters, it was a disaster. And Maria Kovacic, a Liberal senator for New South Wales, was talking about this on the page of The Guardian, and saying, we lost because our policies failed to resonate. And, we needed to win over women, we need to win over people in cities, we need to win over a broad swathe of Australian people. But the policies were geared towards this ecosystem of conservative media where, they thought it was a fantastic idea, but it just failed to resonate with the public.
Yeah, look, I agree with all of that. I guess one other thing I would say was about that disjuncture between what a lot of papers were telling us before Saturday and what they've said after. I mean, I think, to be fair, editorial writers and the journalists in the field don't necessarily always work in concert with each other, and that's fine, and it's not a paper's job to pick a winner. I do think it's interesting, though, how a lot of journalism failed to really report how bad the Liberals campaign was when it was happening. Like, obviously people aren't going to be leaking out of the Liberals during the campaign, but there was a lot of evidence on the face of things that the campaign was flailing, that policies, the simple maths of some of the policies around the public service, around the migration cuts, just simply did not add up. And I think there was a bit of an unwillingness to say this campaign is A, full of holes, and B, really failing. I think that comes from a few things. Like, I know that some people say, oh, this is sort of a bit of a conspiracy by the mainstream media or something, and I think that's not what's going on here. I think there is a bit of a loss of journalists trusting their instincts about when a party is failing, because journalists really failed to predict the Trump win in 2016, the Morrison win in 2019, Brexit. There's a bit of an unwillingness to go out on a limb and say, hey, this is not going well for this side, because you don't want to be caught out the next day. But I also just think there's a perception sometimes among journalists that if you do, call a duck because it's quacking like a duck, then, that's a sign of your bias. And it's not. It's our job to point out and to appraise things in real time. Otherwise, why do readers trust you? If we're all just waiting for the results on election day, well, then what's the point of reading coverage during the campaign?
I completely agree. And one place where that was really evident was the nuclear policy. Now, I think the Coalition did a good job early on of getting voters to be nuclear curious, as they said, to sort of say, this is one way you could get to net zero. This is a zero emissions technology. Why doesn't Labor even think about it? But then when their policy came out, it just simply did not add up. The claims that they were making about it being cheaper or about it being a way for us to actually do something about reducing emissions did not add up. Any way that you looked at it, whatever you thought, it's the one, you could put the three-eyed fish theory to bed and say, okay, this is a technology we really need to look at. And it did not make any sense. And it was sort of quite evidently just a way to not do anything about emissions reduction for another decade and paper over the internal differences between the coalition. And I don't think it's bias at all that we just said so.
I want to talk a little bit specifically about the Greens as well, because they've lost seats, including Max Chandler-Mather, their housing spokesman, and, of course, Adam Bandt, their leader. What happened there? Because I suspect there's not just one answer to that question.
No, there's not one answer. Look, I think the Greens in some ways were unlucky with the way that the preferences split. A lot of Liberal preferences that they gained last time pretty much evaporated this time round in those seats in Brisbane particularly.
I mean, that had to do with the discrepancy in the votes of the major parties too,
Yeah, and the declining vote. So there was a bit of luck involved in some of those seats, but also, if you watch the Prime Minister on 7:30 on Wednesday night, he absolutely got stuck into Max Chandler-Mather, and his proposition is that the Greens lost votes because they spent too much time blocking Labor's policies on housing, on environment and other issues that Greens voters really do care about. Look, I don't know if that's true, and it's very hard to kind of do that through looking at numbers.
But is it? Because their vote wasn't down in the Senate. It was pretty steady in the Senate.
But it did go down in some of the seats. Like Adam Bandt had a swing against him. It's very interesting, that discrepancy. As with every other aspect of this election, I think people are reading what they want to read into the Greens results, right? Like Labor's telling us this is punishment for them blocking housing legislation. The Liberals are telling us this is punishment for them taking a strong stance on the slaughter in Gaza. People are kind of bringing their own agendas to this post-mortem analysis. And I think it's probably, it could be a combination of a bunch of different factors. One other factor I suspect may have been at play was, given we know how toxic Peter Dutton turned out to be to the electorate, were there a lot of swinging voters who just thought, particularly in the lower house where the vote did seem to go down in some seats, even as it held in the Senate, were there some voters who thought, I just don't want to risk Peter Dutton being the Prime Minister. I'm going to go back to voting Labor, where maybe I used to vote, and I'll keep voting Greens in the Senate. Was that a factor? We don't know yet, but I think there's a lot of different reasons at play.
But I also think the preference flows, like when one party's vote collapses that much, it makes them, the Greens can get to 40, what I think Adam Bandt got 40% of the primary vote, and then his preferences just bled out and he couldn't get the last bit to hop over Labor. So I think when the major parties are that far apart, that plays a big role in it in the lower house.
And despite the Greens losing seats and even the independents not going as well in some seats as was expected, there still is a trend that is moving away from the major parties. So what do you think this could mean for Labor and Liberal in the medium term?
Well, I guess Labor would say that they will build on this and probably reverse the trend. And I think that there is, without, wishing to make wild predictions into the future, for the coalition to try and claw their way back to government. It does look like that's at least a 2-term proposition. For the coalition, it goes back to what we were talking about before. They need to become a centre-right party, not a far-right party.
It does show the success that the Liberal Party can have in winning or holding some seats that are either held by the Teals or under threat from the Teals, like Goldstein and Bradfield. And what that shows is when you put up, decent centrist candidates, particularly someone like Giselle Capitarian in Bradfield, who's, a young woman with a good CV, you can succeed in these areas where, in winning back the vote. I think the overall picture, though, for the major parties, that the days of having kind of 50% primary vote are over. They're not coming back. So they do need to also reach out to the Greens and to minor parties to try and build relations with them and bring back their preferences in the lower house and work constructively with them in the Senate as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I guess I would just say in terms of, I think this election, although it was really bad news for the Liberals almost all round, they probably would take some heart from gaining back a couple of those Teal seats if that's where it falls. And it does show that it's not impossible, as Patrick just said. It's interesting, I think, that Peter Dutton didn't campaign in those seats, and that they ran very local campaigns. They put up they were very locally visible. As my understanding is, they campaigned on very local issues. I don't think they were talking a lot about nuclear power in Goldstein. Peter Dutton certainly wasn't showing up at petrol stations in these electorates too often. So I think it just underscores the message about where the party needs to go and what it needs to move away from.
Thank you so much for listening and watching Full Story on YouTube. If you want to support The Guardian's fearless and independent journalism, please click the links in the description and you can subscribe to us and also donate. And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Joe, what was that for you?
So for me this week, obviously federal politics dominated everything, but I did make some time to get into the Met Gala, which I always love. I feel like it's if you're into it, it's something that just like dominates your social feeds all week. I asked my partner what his favorite outfit was at the Met Gala, and he was like, "What?" So I think the algorithm knows. But yeah, I thought it was great, and I thought the theme this week, which was around tailoring and black fashion in America, it just led to a much more creative kind of styles from men. Usually men
The
just
blokes
kind of
had the best outfits.
it was great. You saw like a lot of creativity, and it also meant that the women couldn't just lean into kind of the big poofy gowns, which we usually see. There were a couple, but yeah, I thought it was interesting. It was a bit queer. It was risque. Yeah, I loved it.
I love seeing a lot of designers on that carpet that we haven't seen before. So yes, I also found time for the Met Gala this week. Patrick, what can't you get out of your head this week?
I didn't actually have much engagement with the Met Gala, surprisingly, but I was instead looking at we've just launched a redesigned website and Guardian app as well, which I'm sure many readers have already seen, and I think it looks great. It's fantastic. There's more room for culture, lifestyle, things like the Met Gala on our front, further up in the site that you can, discover things, great reads, culture and lifestyle. It's all there. So
It looks
I'd encourage
great.
people to go and have a look at it.
God, it has been a big week, hasn't it?
Yeah. But aside from the website refresh, I was very taken with the ongoing story of Valerie the Dachshund. Dachshund? Yeah. Yeah, very taken with the story of Valerie the sausage dog. And apparently there's a bit of a conspiracy theory that maybe she wasn't roaming around the wilds eating roadkill. In fact, somebody might have been feeding her because she came back. She was 1.8 kilos heavier than when she left.
Which, when you're a 4K sausage dog, is quite a lot.
Yeah, quite a lot. But, there's arguments over whether that was might have all been muscle from it being in the wilds and,
A conspiracy
on
theory
land.
we can get behind.
Yeah,
we can
absolutely.
get interested
Yeah.
in and have our own theories about. Lenore, this is actually the last episode we're going to have with you until next month because you've got a lot of work to do overseas.
I've got a couple of weeks' work in London and then a couple of weeks' wonderful holiday, which I'm quite looking forward to. So, yeah, I'm out till next month. The story I couldn't get out of my head is slightly more serious than the last two, although I did kind of get into the Met Gala as well. It's that 43% of electricity used across the 5 eastern states between January and March was renewable. And output from battery storage surged by 86% as some large batteries were connected to the grid. And harking back to our previous conversation, that renewable transition can go now because I think some investment was waiting to see whether the disruption of this sort of nuclear idea would hit the system. If with Labor in power, I think they're committed to the transition and it will continue. And I think, friends, that's good news.
It's amazing, particularly considering the policy settings of the past decade or so. I hope you have a great trip and we'll see you back next month. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Bridie.
Thank you,
Thanks, Bridie.
Patrick.
Thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Joe.